When Japanese troops first faced American soldiers in 1941, they didn't fear them. Many had been taught to see Americans as soft, undisciplined, and dependent on machines. By 1945, that contempt had transformed into something very different. Japanese diaries describe American troops as relentless, impossible to stop, and backed by industrial power beyond comprehension. So what changed? What turned mockery into fear? And why did some Japanese soldiers choose death over capture by Americans they'd been told were too weak to fight? The story starts long before the first shots were fired, because Japanese soldiers didn't form their opinions of Americans on the battlefield. Those opinions were carefully constructed. In 1941, Japanese soldiers were issued a manual known as the Senjinkun, or Field Service Code. Sometimes translated with the propaganda title, "Read this and the war can be won," it laid out exactly how Japanese troops should view their Western enemies. Death before surrender. Moral superiority through spiritual strength. Material power meant nothing without fighting spirit. Americans were portrayed as lacking what mattered most. Japanese military culture was built on a modernized version of Bushido, the way of the warrior. This militarized code, intensified during the 1930s and 40s, made dying in battle the ultimate honor and surrender the ultimate disgrace. Discipline, self-sacrifice, and collective duty formed the foundation of their military identity. Americans represented everything opposite to these values: loud, individualistic, and openly proud of their comforts. Japanese soldiers surviving on meager rations of rice and pickled vegetables watched American prisoners eating canned food, smoking cigarettes, and even drinking Coca-Cola. To Japanese troops, this proved weakness. How could soldiers who live so comfortably possibly endure the hardships of real war? The Japanese high command shared this arrogance, and it led to catastrophic miscalculations. In March 1942, during a strategy meeting to assess the war's progress, senior officers concluded that Americans had grown too accustomed to their high standard of living. If that quality of life dropped, they reasoned, American morale would collapse entirely. Pearl Harbor wasn't just about destroying the U.S. Navy. Japan's leadership hoped shock would lead to early defeats that would force the United States into a negotiated peace. Americans wouldn't have the will to fight a prolonged war, or so the thinking went. The strategy seemed to work at first. Early Japanese victories in the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies came quickly. American and British forces retreated under pressure. Japanese troops felt unstoppable. Then, Guadalcanal changed everything. Japanese soldiers who had mocked American courage suddenly found themselves facing relentless waves of U.S. Marines. Diary entries from Japanese soldiers described their confusion and growing concern. Americans kept fighting, despite casualties. Tactics adapted. The collapse everyone predicted never came. American soldiers weren't supposed to adapt. They weren't supposed to keep fighting after taking casualties. They certainly weren't supposed to win. Yet, they did. That's when Japanese soldiers started to realize they'd been lied to. What made it worse was how American forces learned and improved with each battle. At Guadalcanal, U.S. Marines struggled with jungle warfare and tropical diseases. By Tarawa, specialized equipment and tactics for amphibious assaults had been developed. By Iwo Jima, combined arms coordination that Japanese defenders couldn't counter had been perfected. Japanese soldiers noticed this evolution. While Japanese doctrine changed more slowly and lacked flexibility compared to American adaptation, U.S. methods constantly improved. Equipment got better. Training became more realistic. Intelligence gathering became more sophisticated. Every battle taught the Americans something new, and those lessons were applied immediately. Captured Japanese officers later admitted expecting American forces to repeat the same mistakes. Instead, each attack was different, better, and harder to predict. This adaptability terrified Japanese commanders because their enemy was learning faster than they could respond. The battlefield lessons were one thing. The industrial warfare was another level entirely. While Japanese troops ran out of ammunition and starved on half rations, American forces had everything. Fresh supplies arrived constantly. Hot meals were standard. Wounded soldiers received immediate medical care and were evacuated to field hospitals. Even small American units had access to artillery support that could obliterate Japanese positions in minutes. Japanese diaries from the Pacific campaigns return to this theme again and again. The sentiment of fighting an endless tide appears repeatedly. Americans kept coming. Their ships returned faster than Japan could sink them. Japan could win battles, but every victory cost them irreplaceable men and equipment. America replaced losses faster than Japan could inflict them. For Japanese soldiers watching this unfold, it was psychologically devastating. One Japanese officer reflected after the war that they had believed they could outlast American forces. American resilience surprised them. Strength wasn't just in machines, but in determination. The numbers tell the story. In 1943, the United States produced approximately 85,000 aircraft. Japan produced roughly 76,000 aircraft during the entire war. American shipyards launched escort carriers faster than Japan could build destroyers. By 1944, some isolated Japanese units reported extremely limited ammunition, while American batteries fired hundreds of shells in a single barrage. This disparity created hopelessness. Japanese soldiers could fight bravely, die honorably, and achieve nothing. The Americans would still be there tomorrow, with more men, more supplies, and more firepower. One group of American troops became the focus of particular terror: the U.S. Marines. Japanese propaganda seized on the Marines as the embodiment of American brutality. Rumors circulated that Marines were recruited from the worst corners of American society: prisons and mental asylums. Soldiers heard stories that Marines killed prisoners, mutilated bodies, and impaled them on stakes as warnings. These tales were designed to instill terror and fortify Japanese resolve to never surrender. And they worked. Japanese soldiers described Marines not as ordinary enemy troops, but as something more dangerous and inhuman. From Guadalcanal onward, Marines earned a reputation as relentless assault troops who never quit. The propaganda wasn't entirely fabrication. Marines did fight with particular ferocity, and documented incidents of trophy taking, skulls, teeth, and ears collected by some individual soldiers, gave credence to the worst rumors. When Japanese civilians and soldiers heard these stories, some true and most exaggerated, surrender seemed impossible. The irony is that these exaggerated depictions often backfired. Instead of strengthening resolve, they heightened anxiety. Japanese soldiers facing Marine assaults weren't inspired. They were terrified. And that terror manifested in tragic ways. By mid-1944, American forces had reached Saipan, just 1,200 miles from Tokyo. After brutal fighting and a final, desperate banzai charge, Japanese defenders were shattered. The civilians, conditioned for years to believe Americans were monsters, now faced what they believed was their fate. American soldiers watched in horror as whole families walked to the island's cliffs. Some clung to each other. Some prayed. Many wept. And then, they jumped. Hundreds, possibly over 1,000, chose death over capture. One 5-year-old boy named Kiyoshi Shiroma remembered his father's desperate warning: "The Americans will kill you. You must die yourself." Kiyoshi followed the crowd and leapt, but survived when his clothing snagged on a branch. He later described watching other families fall past him into the rocks below. U.S. troops tried to stop them. They shouted assurances. They posted Japanese-speaking interpreters. Fear had replaced reason. Saipan had roughly 22,000 civilians on the island. Between 10,000 and 15,000 died during the battle, with cliff suicides accounting for hundreds to over 1,000 of those deaths. Similar scenes unfolded on Tinian, and later on a massive scale at Okinawa. Behind all of it was the same driving force: propaganda-built terror, battlefield-hardened paranoia, and the realization that the enemy Japan once mocked might actually be unstoppable. Several factors reinforced Japanese terror as the war continued. Close quarters brutality played a major role. Japanese soldiers often pretended to surrender before detonating grenades or attacking with knives at point-blank range. American medics, often moving unarmed to treat wounded soldiers, were killed this way repeatedly. U.S. troops learned not to trust surrender gestures. Legitimate surrenders were sometimes met with preemptive gunfire. To Japanese observers, this looked like proof of American savagery. They didn't see it as a response to their own tactics. They saw it as confirmation of what propaganda had told them. Americans showed no mercy. American firepower provoked perhaps the most visceral dread. Japanese diaries frequently mention the overwhelming power of U.S. naval guns. Nighttime bombardments made sleep impossible. Shells fell endlessly, day after day, with no way to respond. To soldiers raised to believe that spirit could overcome material disadvantages, this display of overwhelming industrial power was psychologically crushing. Diary entries describe the impossibility of enduring the endless bombardment from ships they couldn't even see. Then came the realization that retreat was impossible. In earlier wars, Japanese forces could withdraw, regroup, and fight again. In the Pacific, every island was isolated. Once American forces landed, there was nowhere to go. Supplies couldn't arrive. Reinforcements couldn't reach them. Fight until death, or until the island fell. Those were the only options. This created a psychological trap. Japanese soldiers knew they couldn't win. They knew they couldn't escape. And they'd been taught that surrender was worse than death. So they fought with the desperation of men who had no other choice. By 1945, the Pacific War had become a feedback loop of terror. Japan taught its people that Americans were monsters. Japanese soldiers acted in ways that hardened Americans into viewing them as fanatics. American responses confirmed Japanese suspicions, which justified more resistance and more brutality. Neither side saw the other as fully human anymore. Okinawa was the culmination of this horror. The battle lasted 82 days. Between 100,000 and 140,000 Okinawan civilians died, many caught between the armies. Thousands more were pressed into forced labor or encouraged to commit suicide rather than surrender. When U.S. planners studied Okinawa's casualty rates, they concluded that an invasion of mainland Japan might kill millions on both sides. The Japanese government broadcast increasingly desperate propaganda, urging civilians to resist to the death, warning that Americans would commit atrocities against anyone who surrendered. Terror had consumed the home islands. Then, the war ended. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, combined with Soviet entry into the war, forced Japan's surrender. When American occupation forces finally arrived in Japan, many civilians were shocked to be treated with professionalism and restraint. Wartime propaganda had created a distorted image on both sides. So why did Japanese soldiers come to dread American troops? At the start of the war, they didn't. Many mocked Americans as soft and undisciplined. Japanese propaganda and cultural arrogance convinced them that American materialism and individualism were fatal weaknesses. Spirit would triumph over machinery. On the battlefield, that changed quickly. Japanese soldiers came to respect American firepower, adaptability, and combined arms tactics. Victories became meaningless as America replaced every loss with overwhelming speed. Industrial might that Japan couldn't match became an enemy of its own. As defeat became inevitable, respect turned into something darker. Dread of American strength. Dread of American endurance. Propaganda-fed nightmares convinced thousands that death was preferable to capture. The U.S. Marines, in particular, became symbols of this terror, portrayed as inhuman rather than soldiers. By the war's end, Japanese soldiers weren't just fighting Americans. They were fighting the inevitability of American victory, the psychological weight of endless bombardment, and the terror instilled by years of propaganda that had succeeded far too well. Much of this terror was manufactured. Americans weren't the demons Japanese propaganda described. Yet the brutality of the war, the dehumanization on both sides, and the desperate tactics employed by Japanese forces created a self-fulfilling prophecy. Each side confirmed the other's worst expectations. Japanese soldiers who survived to become prisoners were often shocked by their treatment. They were fed, their wounds were treated. They weren't tortured or executed. For many, it was the first time they realized they'd been lied to about their enemy. By then, hundreds of thousands had already died. Civilians had jumped from cliffs. Soldiers had charged into machine gun fire rather than surrender. An entire generation had been shaped by terror that didn't need to exist. The lesson extends beyond World War II. Propaganda replacing truth. Enemies dehumanized. Terror weaponized more effectively than any bomb. Japanese soldiers didn't dread American troops because Americans were monsters. They dreaded them because they'd been taught to see them that way. And that manufactured terror, more than any weapon, shaped how the Pacific War was fought and how it ended. If you're interested in more untold stories from World War II, subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next.